Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive into The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Forget the dry equations and financial models. This book, and our discussion today, is all about the surprising ways our human quirks, our emotions, and, our personal histories deeply shape our financial lives.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is to try and uncover why doing well with money seems to have far less to do with how, let's say, intellectually brilliant you are, and a lot more to do with your behavior, how you actually act. We'll explore some counterintuitive truths, challenge some common assumptions, and hopefully give you a fresh, more human perspective on what truly builds financial success and, maybe more importantly, happiness.
So if you've ever felt like your financial decisions aren't always purely, rational, well, you're definitely in for a treat. Let's unpack this. Diving into Housel's work, the first concept that really jumped out at me was this idea that financial success isn't just about crunching numbers or having a super high IQ. It's profoundly rooted in our behavior. Can you maybe unpack what Housel means by that, perhaps with an example from the book that really drove this point home for you?
Absolutely. Yeah, the book opens with this really powerful, almost shocking contrast that illustrates this perfectly. On one hand, you have this reckless, high-flying executive. There's this memorable scene where he pulls out a brick of cash to pay $5,000 for a $500 lamp, basically telling the manager not to insult him again. This person, despite all the appearance of wealth, ultimately went broke, completely broke, because of uncontrolled actions and ego.
And then the flip side of that coin, you have Ronald Read.
Exactly. Ronald Read. He was a janitor and gas station attendant from rural Vermont. No formal financial education, no flashy career, nothing like that.
Right.
Yet, he quietly amassed an $8 million fortune just through consistent saving and investing. He even became a wealthy philanthropist.
Wow.
And what's striking is that Read's success wasn't due to, amazing market timing or picking hot stocks. It was purely his behavioral skills.
Just the simple stuff?
Simple but hard. His patience, his discipline, his ability to consistently save and just let compounding do its work over decades. Meanwhile, the executive, for all his apparent genius or success, was a financial disaster because he just lost control of his emotions. It really highlights that what goes on in your head, your emotional intelligence, maybe tells you everything about your financial future, much more than just technical knowledge.
That's incredibly insightful. But it raises a question then. If behavior is this critical, why do we, as a society, maybe especially the financial industry, often treat money like it's physics? Full of rigid rules and predictable laws, instead of psychology, which is all about nuance, emotion, individual differences. It feels like we're kind of missing the forest for the trees sometimes.
It's a really crucial question. The financial industry, unlike maybe medicine, which is constantly adapting based on new discoveries, it often seems stuck in this sort of Newtonian view of money. We crave certainty, formulas, we want things to be neat.
Right.
But human decisions about money, they're rarely made in a vacuum or purely with a spreadsheet. They're made at the dinner table, like you said, shaped by our personal history, by ego, pride, even clever marketing.
And building right on that point, another core insight from the book is just how profoundly our personal experiences shape our views on money. It's not just a matter of having different opinions. It's almost like we're looking through completely different lenses based on where we've been.
Yes. And what's truly fascinating here is the power of that lived experience over just learned knowledge. The book argues pretty strongly that what you've personally experienced is far more compelling, far more impactful than anything you learned secondhand in a book or, a classroom. Think about it. Someone who grew up in poverty will inevitably think about risk and saving very differently than, say, the child of a wealthy banker. It's unavoidable. Someone who lived through periods of high inflation, they'll have a vastly different gut feeling about bonds and holding cash than someone who only experienced stable prices. Your career path, where you live, even the decade you were born, all these things create a unique financial worldview for each of us.
It's such a powerful point that your personal experiences, right, no matter how intense they felt to you, they actually make up this tiny infinitesimal fraction of global events. Like the book says maybe 0.000000001% of all economic history. Yet, Housel argues, those tiny slivers account for roughly 80% of how you personally think the world works.
Exactly. And that explains why equally smart people can look at the very same data, the same charts, and come to radically different conclusions about how the economy works or the best way to invest.
Yeah.
It's often not about intelligence at all. It's about their unique journey, the lens they're looking through.
Can you give an example? Maybe the lottery ticket one?
Oh, lottery ticket example's perfect. In the U.S., people spend more on lottery tickets than on movies, video games, and music combined. It's huge.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And who buys them? Predominantly people in lower income households. They spend something like 4 times more than the highest income households. Now, from a purely rational financial perspective, looking at the odds, it seems illogical, right? Crazy even. The chances of winning big are astronomically small.
Right. You'd never advise that based on a spreadsheet.
Never. And yet for them, it's not really about the odds, is it?
No.
For someone living paycheck to paycheck, maybe burdened by debt, buying that lottery ticket might be, as the book puts it so well, the only time in our lives we can hold a tangible dream of getting the good stuff that you already have.
That's powerful phrasing.
It is. They're not buying a financial asset with a high expected return. They're paying for hope, for a brief escape, for a dream. And in their unique context, that decision makes a certain kind of sense. It truly highlights how few financial decisions are purely made with a spreadsheet. They're woven from personal history, unique worldviews, ego, and, the odd incentives we scramble together into a narrative that simply works for us at that moment.
Okay, so we've explored our internal world, how our behavior and our past experiences really shape our money decisions. But what about the mechanics, the fundamental engine of wealth creation itself? The book then turns to perhaps the most powerful yet really counterintuitive tool, compounding.
Yeah, this concept is notoriously difficult for our brains to really grasp because we tend to think linearly, straight lines. Not exponentially, not curves. Housel uses this striking analogy of ice ages. Think about it. A tiny bit of snow that doesn't melt one summer can, over thousands and thousands of years, lead to miles-thick ice sheets covering continents.
Right. It's not one big snowfall.
Exactly. It's not the immense amount of snow in any one year, but the consistent, persistent accumulation over vast amounts of time. Small changes, sustained over extraordinary periods, can create truly extraordinary results.
And when we connect this to the bigger picture, like investing, look at Warren Buffett. So many books, so many articles meticulously dissect how he invests. They analyze his stock picks, his strategies.
Yeah, the what?
Right, the what. But his real secret, the book argues pretty convincingly, isn't just his skill, though obviously he's skilled. It's his incredible amount of time in the market. He's been investing successfully since he was basically a kid. And the book calculates that a staggering 99.9% of his, $84.5 billion net worth came after his 50th birthday.
99.9%. It's mind-boggling.
It really is.
And to illustrate the power of that time even more, compare him to Jim Simons, the brilliant mathematician head of Renaissance Technologies. Simons has compounded money at an absolutely astonishing 66% annually since 1988. Compare that to Buffett's 22%.
Huge difference in rate of return.
Massive. Yet despite Simons' far superior annual returns, he's still about 75% less rich than Buffett. Why?
Time.
Simons only really found his stride and started compounding seriously when he was around 50. So he had less than half the number of years to let that incredible compounding work its magic compared to Buffett. It just underscores that time is arguably a more crucial factor than pure skill when it comes to accumulating extreme wealth. Our linear brains just aren't wired to intuitively grasp how quickly things can grow over truly long periods.
Which brings us sort of naturally to this other crucial yet often overlooked concept, the idea of enough.
Yes. Joseph Heller, the author of Catch-22, he just encapsulated this perfectly. He was at a party with some billionaire, apparently, and someone pointed out that this billionaire had made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his massively successful novel, Catch-22, over its entire lifetime.
Ouch.
Yeah. And Heller's reply was legendary. He just said, yes, but I have something he will never have.
Enough. Exactly.
That sentiment feels profoundly critical on finance, doesn't it? There's just no good reason, logically, to risk what you already have and truly need for something you don't have and don't actually need.
It seems obvious, but history is littered with people who forgot.
Yeah. The book shares some really tragic stories. Individuals like Rajat Gupta, the former McKinsey CEO, already worth $100 million, a huge amount.
Yeah.
But he risked it all, chasing more, and ended up in prison for insider trading.
Or the hedge fund long-term capital management. Staffed by Nobel laureates, brilliant multimillionaires. But they took on so much risk in their relentless quest for more that they completely blew up in 1998, right in the middle of a roaring bull market.
It's crazy. As Warren Buffett wisely put it, something like, to make money they didn't have and didn't need, they risked what they did have and did need. And that's foolish. Period.
Simple as that.
Yeah. Your reputation, your freedom, your independence, family, friends, happiness, these things are invaluable. They're priceless. And your best shot at keeping them is knowing when to stop taking risks that might harm them. It's about understanding, truly internalizing when you have enough.
That idea of enough isn't just about, avoiding greed or excess. It seems deeply tied to ensuring you actually keep what you've managed to build. Because as the book argues really powerfully, getting money is one thing, but keeping it is a whole different skill set.
Completely different.
In fact, survival is presented as maybe the single most important word in long-term money success.
It's a theme echoed by some massively successful firms, like Sequoia Capital, the venture capital giant. They apparently attribute their incredible longevity, decades of success, to always being afraid of going out of business.
Always paranoid.
In a healthy way, yeah. They constantly plan for tomorrow not being like yesterday, constantly adapting, constantly focused on surviving the next downturn. Because compounding, that patient engine of wealth we talked about, only works if you can actually stay in the game. You have to endure the unpredictable ups and downs for years, even decades, without being forced out.
The sources share those two contrasting yet somehow equally tragic stories from the 1929 stock market crash. Jesse Livermore, the legendary trader, famously made a fortune during the crash, a genius move.
Right, while others were losing everything.
Exactly, like Abraham Jermansky, a multi-millionaire real estate developer at the time who lost absolutely everything. But then, fast forward just a few years, and Livermore, despite his brilliance, also lost everything and tragically, eventually took his own life.
It's chilling. Both were clearly exceptional at getting rich, but equally poor, it turned out, at staying rich. Survival eluded them both in the end.
So, how do you cultivate that survival instinct?
Well, what's so profound here is the idea that planning is important, but the most important part of every plan is to plan on the plan not going according to plan.
Plan for failure, essentially.
Or plan for surprise.
Yeah.
Housel calls this having room for error. It's not necessarily about being overly conservative or missing out on big opportunities. It's more about building in a buffer.
Like a safety margin. Exactly. Maybe it's an emergency fund. Maybe it's a diversified portfolio so one bad bet doesn't sink you. Maybe it's just holding more cash than seems optimal. It's about building in resilience so you can endure market downturns, unexpected job losses, medical bills, or simply life's inevitable curveballs. That endurance, that ability to just stick around is what truly allows compounding to work its magic over decades. It prevents you from making desperate, ill-timed sales at the worst possible moment. And that avoidance of ruin, in the long run, can do more for your lifetime returns than picking dozens of big winners.
And that endurance, that ability to stick it out, is key to paying what the book calls the price of market returns.
Yeah.
What exactly is that price? It's not just fees, right?
No, not just commissions or expense ratios. The real price of successful investing isn't just dollars, it's the intangible costs. It's the volatility, the fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, the inevitable regret you feel when things go down.
That pit in your stomach. That's it, exactly. These feelings are like a fee. They're the cost of admission you have to pay to access the market's potential long-term returns. And trying to avoid this fee, trying to get the returns without the volatility, often leads to paying double or suffering far worse consequences down the line.
Like the GE example.
Yeah, the GE example under former CEO Jack Welch is classic. He famously smoothed earnings to consistently meet Wall Street expectations quarter after quarter. Shareholders got these nice, stable, predictable gains for years. It felt great.
Felt safe.
Felt very safe. But the bill for that artificial stability eventually came due. GE shareholders suffered massive, painful losses later on. Trying to get market returns while avoiding the inherent price, the ups and downs, is, as the book eloquently puts it, like trying Grand Theft Auto. You might get away with it for a while, but it usually ends badly.
That's a stark warning. And it ties into another really critical point Housel makes. People are playing entirely different financial games, often without even realizing it.
Oh, totally. A day trader flipping stocks based on momentum charts has a completely different time horizon, a different goal, a different definition of success than a long-term investor saving for retirement 30 years away.
Right.
And comparing your financial journey, your results, to someone else's without knowing what game they are playing is just a recipe for disaster, or at least a lot of unnecessary misery and bad decisions.
Because that day trader buying a stock you think is overvalued isn't necessarily irrational.
Not at all. They're just playing a different game. Your careful long-term valuation is completely irrelevant to their short-term strategy. We judge others without understanding their objectives.
Which brings us to, I love this one, the man in the car paradox.
Yes. It's such a brilliant observation about human nature. When you see someone driving a really fancy, expensive car, a Ferrari, say, you rarely actually think, wow, that person driving is cool.
No, you don't.
What you actually think, subconsciously maybe, is, wow, if I had that car, people would think I'm cool.
Guilty as charged.
We all are. People seek respect and admiration, and they think buying flashy things will bring it. But it often brings less of it than imagined, because other people are too busy imagining themselves in your stuff. So true wealth, Housel argues, is actually what you don't see. It's the financial assets that haven't yet been converted into the stuff you can show off. It's the cars not bought, the diamonds not purchased, the watches unworn. Wealth is the option value created by assets.
Okay, so if wealth is what you don't spend, why save it? Beyond specific goals like, a house down payment or retirement, What's the deeper purpose?
Well, beyond those specific goals, saving is fundamentally a hedge. It's a buffer against life's inevitable surprises, the things you can't predict. But maybe even more importantly, saving buys you control. Control over your time. The ability to choose what you do, when you do it, where you do it, and with whom you do it. That is truly priceless. It's the highest dividend money pays. Having options. Having flexibility.
Flexibility, that's a good word for it.
Yeah. And this sort of raises an important question. Why do we put such a high value on being perfectly rational with money when our emotions and our basic human nature play such an undeniably huge role?
We beat ourselves up for not being robots.
Exactly. The book points out, quite bluntly, that we are screwed up emotional persons, not spreadsheets. And that's okay. We shouldn't necessarily strive to be perfectly cold and rational like Mr. Spock. We should strive to be reasonable.
Reasonable versus rational. What's the difference there?
Reasonable means making decisions that work for you in the real world, acknowledging your emotions in your context, like Harry Markowitz, a Nobel laureate in economics, the father of modern portfolio theory. Even he chose a simple, diversified portfolio for his own retirement because he wanted to minimize future regret, not maximize theoretical returns on paper.
So even the experts aren't purely rational.
Right. Or Jack Bogle, founder of Vanguard, famously invested some money in his son's actively managed higher fee fund. Why? Because family relationships mattered more than optimizing every last basis point. These decisions seem indefensible on a spreadsheet, but they can make perfect sense in real life and bring you greater independence, peace of mind, or happiness.
This really touches on something researchers call the end of history illusion. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's this deep-seated tendency we all have to underestimate just how much we are going to change in the future. We recognize how much we've changed from our past selves, but we somehow think our current selves are the finished product.
That who I am today is who I'll be at 60.
Pretty much. And that makes long-term financial planning tricky. What you desperately want at 20, maybe that sports car, might lead to profound regret at 40 or 70 when your priorities have completely shifted. It's incredibly difficult to stick to a rigid, extreme money plan when what you want out of life, or even who you fundamentally are, changes so much over time.
So what's the practical implication of that? Avoid extremes.
Exactly. It's a powerful argument for avoiding extreme financial plans. Aim for balance instead. Moderate savings that you can actually stick with. Moderate amounts of free time, maybe a moderate commute instead of a killer one for a slightly higher salary. Endurance is key in finance, and balance helps you stick with a plan that can adapt as you adapt. We tend to adapt to most circumstances anyway. The initial thrill of extreme wealth or extreme frugality wears off, but their downsides, like the sacrifices made or the rigidity imposed, can become enduring regrets later on.
Now, if we connect some of these psychological threads to the bigger picture, the book touches on how the modern American consumer sort of evolved, especially after World War II.
Yeah, it's a fascinating bit of history. Post-World War II policies, things like persistently low interest rates set by the government, and a deliberate boom in readily available consumer credit, mortgages, car loans, credit cards. These things consciously fostered a culture where consumption wasn't just a byproduct of growth. It became an explicit economic strategy.
Designed to keep the economy humming.
Right, designed specifically to prevent a return to the Great Depression by encouraging people to spend. And while that post-war era, maybe the 50s and 60s, saw a relative narrowing of the rich-poor gap, a sort of equalization of lifestyles, people tended to own similar kinds of cars, watch the same TV shows, live in similar-sized houses. The last 35 or 40 years have seen rising inequality again, a widening gap. Yet those societal expectations for similar lifestyles, maybe fueled by media and advertising, still persist.
Keeping up with the Joneses, even if the Joneses are now billionaires.
Kind of. It leads many people to stretch their finances, often taking on significant debt simply to try and keep up with aspirations that are increasingly inflated by the genuinely wealthy at the very top. Housel notes that the average new American home, for instance, is now something like 50% larger than median wages would suggest is actually affordable based on historical norms. There's a profound disconnect.
Okay, shifting gears slightly for our last main point. Let's address optimism versus pessimism in finance. At first glance, optimism seems obviously better, but why does Housel argue that pessimism often sounds so much smarter? And what's the financial trap lurking in that way of thinking?
It's a really sharp observation. Pessimism often sounds incredibly intelligent, more plausible, and certainly more captivating because setbacks tend to happen quickly and dramatically.
Like a market crash.
Exactly. Think of the 2008 financial crisis or a sudden pandemic or a plane crash. There's sudden, huge, attention-grabbing negative events. Progress, on the other hand, usually happens slowly, quietly, incrementally, often over decades. It's easy to overlook or dismiss. Real optimists, in Housel's view, don't believe everything will be great all the time. That's complacency. They believe the odds of a good outcome are generally in their favor over the long run, even acknowledging there will be painful setbacks along the way.
Can you give an example of that slow progress?
Sure, like how U.S. oil production suddenly surged due to fracking technology, going from 5 million barrels a day to 13 million in just about a decade, completely changing global energy dynamics. Or think about how medicine evolved from really antiquated, harmful practices like bloodletting just a couple of centuries ago to life-saving vaccines and treatments today. Problems inherently incentivize solutions. The world changes constantly. And relying too heavily on historical data, assuming the future will look just like the past, can become this historians as prophets fallacy.
Especially when big structural changes happen.
Exactly. Things like the invention of the 401k, or the rise of venture capital fueling innovation, or globalization. These have shifted the financial landscape so dramatically in just a few decades. The past simply isn't a perfect map of the future, and being overly pessimistic based only on past negative events can cause you to miss out on future progress.
So the lesson isn't predict better.
No, the correct lesson from surprises isn't that we should somehow predict them more accurately next time. It's simply that the world is inherently surprising. We should approach the future with a healthy dose of humility about what we can truly predict, and focus instead on building in that resilience, that room for error, to handle the unexpected when it inevitably arrives.
Okay, let's try and wrap this all up. After diving into all these insights from the psychology of money, what's the key takeaway for your financial journey? What does this all mean for you, the listener?
I think it really means respecting those invisible, often uncomfortable forces of luck and risk, acknowledging they play a role, and then focusing intently on what you can actually control.
Like your behavior.
Exactly. Your behavior, your savings rate, your patience, your time horizon. It means maybe cultivating a little less ego and aiming to build more actual wealth, remembering that true wealth is often what you don't see and what you consciously choose not to spend.
It's also about saving, maybe even just saving for saving's sake, without a specific goal always in mind. Building that general hedge against life's surprises, and perhaps most importantly, using that saving to buy yourself control over your own time and your own options.
Right. Flexibility is wealth too.
And it's about understanding that the price of success in investing, the volatility, the doubt, the fear, isn't a fine you pay for doing something wrong. It's an unavoidable fee, a cost of admission worth paying for the potential of the market's long-term returns.
And critically, I think, it's about embracing the idea that you are a person, a complex emotional human being, not a spreadsheet. Being reasonable often trumps being strictly rational in the messy real world. Your emotions, your experiences, your evolving self, these are all valid inputs in making your personal financial decisions.
This deep dive really reminds us that our financial journey isn't just about cold, hard numbers, is it? It's a deeply human story, shaped by our past, our present desires, and crucially, the future selves we are constantly and often unpredictably becoming.
And maybe the provocative thought to leave you mulling over is this. How much of your current financial plan, the one you have right now, was actually designed by a past you, a person who maybe doesn't fully exist anymore, with priorities you no longer hold quite as tightly? And what would your future you, the person you'll be in 10 or 20 years, truly appreciate if you started building it into your plan today?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it sparks some interesting reflections and maybe some useful conversations for you.